The war in Europe was a nightmare of mud, steel, and fire. Armies clashed across forests, villages, and shattered cities, and in every corner, soldiers faced the terror of battle. Yet amid the chaos, some men became legends figures, whose very names sent shivers down the spines of their enemies. One such man was a Canadian general, a leader who would come to be feared more than any American commander by the German army. His story begins far from the roar of cannons, in the quiet, snow-dusted streets of Ontario, Canada, where a young man first discovered the discipline, resilience, and vision that would later make him a commander unlike any other. From an early age, he showed a sharp mind and an unyielding determination. Those who knew him spoke of a boy who would not back down from a challenge, whose curiosity about strategy and leadership often set him apart from his peers. While many young men of his generation dreamed of adventure, he dreamed of mastery over his own abilities, and mastery over the chaos that life could hurl at him. By the time he reached adulthood, this drive had matured into a formidable intellect, one that would eventually shape the tactics and decisions of entire battles. When the Second World War erupted, the world plunged into darkness. Millions of soldiers marched to the front lines, and generals faced the monumental task of leading men through destruction and death. Yet the Canadian officer stood out almost immediately. His reputation was not built on raw numbers or flashy maneuvers, but on an uncanny ability to anticipate the enemy, to read the battlefield like a living, breathing map. Where others reacted, he predicted. Where others hesitated, he struck with precision. It was in the harrowing landscapes of Normandy that he first earned a reputation that would echo across Europe. After the D-Day landings, as Allied forces struggled to break through the fortified German positions, this Canadian general demonstrated a unique combination of courage and cunning. His forces moved with a discipline that seemed almost mechanical, yet there was an artistry in their execution. Villages that should have taken weeks to secure fell in days. Counterattacks were met with strategies that seemed impossible, almost clairvoyant. For German commanders watching from afar, reports of his success stirred a growing dread. But fear was not the only emotion he inspired. Among his troops, he became a symbol of hope and resolve. Soldiers spoke of his presence on the front lines, his willingness to walk alongside them through the worst of hell. He was not a distant figure issuing orders from behind a desk. He was there in the mud, the rain, and the smoke, understanding the stakes and sharing the risks. This earned him loyalty, devotion, and a morale that often proved decisive in engagements where victory seemed uncertain. Even his opponents noticed. Captured reports, intercepted messages, and intelligence briefings from the Germans reveal a growing obsession with this Canadian commander. While American generals were respected for their overwhelming industrial strength and resources, few could match his tactical ingenuity and relentless pursuit of the objective. German officers began to adjust their deployments not just to counter forces, but to anticipate his moves specifically. It was as though the very shape of their defense was dictated by his presence, and in the quiet moments before battle, fear of facing him settled like a shadow over their plans. His tactics were not revolutionary in the sense of invention alone. They were the product of understanding human psychology as much as military strategy. He understood that fear, confusion, and hesitation could be as lethal as any weapon. By exploiting these vulnerabilities, he turned moments of indecision into decisive victories. Time and again, he forced the enemy to act on his terms, dictating the tempo and scope of engagements. And with each success, the legend of the Canadian general grew, not only among his allies but within the enemy's own ranks. Yet it was not sheer brilliance alone that made him formidable. It was his unwavering composure in the face of chaos. In battles where units faltered, where artillery rained down and tanks burned, he remained calm. Decisions were made with clarity, and those decisions carried the weight of experience and intuition. Troops who followed him learned to trust his judgment implicitly, and this cohesion, this bond between leader and soldier, became a weapon in itself, one that the German army struggled to counter. By the time the Allied forces were pushing across France and into Belgium, the Germans had begun to speak of him in terms that were almost reverential, if tinged with dread. They whispered of a commander who seemed to appear everywhere, striking with precision, vanishing before retaliation could be organized. They called him relentless. They called him meticulous, and they called him dangerous in ways that few American generals had ever been. But even as his reputation spread, he remained focused on the task at hand. There was no pursuit of fame, no personal ambition beyond victory and the survival of his men. Every maneuver, every engagement was calculated, deliberate, and executed with a commitment to excellence that few could rival. The battlefield became not just a place of conflict, but a stage on which his leadership unfolded with dramatic intensity, a stage that left observers, both friend and foe, watching with awe and apprehension. And so, as Europe burned and the war pressed onward, this Canadian general carved his name into history. His story is one of intellect, courage, and relentless drive, but it is also a story of humanity, of leadership, that inspired men to achieve the extraordinary in the face of terror. The Germans feared him because he was unpredictable, precise, and unyielding. His victories were not accidents. They were the product of vision, skill, and a deep understanding of the human element of warfare. In the next phase of his journey, as we will see, he would take these qualities to heights that seemed almost impossible. From the fields and villages of France to the dense forests and fortified towns of Belgium, he would confront challenges that tested not just his tactical mind, but his resolve, his creativity, and his ability to shape the course of history itself. And in doing so, he would earn a fear that transcended ordinary respect, a fear that haunted the German command long after the smoke of battle had cleared. By the time the Allies were consolidating their positions in Normandy, it had become clear that this Canadian general was no ordinary commander. Every move he made seemed to unsettle the German lines, turning familiar defensive positions into traps that only his forces could navigate. His reputation had spread through the ranks, and German officers began to plan not just to fight the Canadians, but to survive facing this one man. What made him extraordinary wasn't just his strategy, it was his ability to see battles not as a series of confrontations, but as a complex, living puzzle, where every piece could be manipulated to his advantage. His troops often described him as a general who understood the flow of combat almost instinctively. He could assess a battlefield in moments, deciding not only where to strike, but when and how to do it. He had a gift for reading the enemy's intentions before they even acted, predicting movements, reinforcements, and retreats with uncanny accuracy. And while many generals relied heavily on artillery, numbers, or technology, he relied equally on timing, surprise, and psychology. A sudden night attack, a feint toward one village while the real force struck another, these became hallmarks of his approach. One of his most remarkable campaigns took place in the bocage country of Normandy. These dense hedgerows and narrow lanes were a nightmare for any attacking army, but he transformed them into opportunities. He studied the terrain meticulously, understanding that every hedge, ditch, and stone wall could be turned into an advantage. His troops learned to move quietly and efficiently, striking with sudden violence where the enemy least expected it. German soldiers, trained and seasoned, found themselves ambushed in ways they hadn't anticipated, and morale began to waver under the pressure of a commander who seemed to anticipate every defensive measure. There were moments when his brilliance became almost mythic. In one engagement, his forces faced a heavily fortified German position, well stocked with machine guns and artillery. The Americans had attempted to advance, only to be repelled with heavy losses. The Canadians, under his leadership, approached with a different plan. Rather than attacking head-on, he orchestrated a series of coordinated feints, drawing the defenders' attention to one flank, while the main assault crept along a less obvious route. By the time the Germans realized the true direction of the attack, it was too late. Positions that had seemed impregnable fell within hours. Reports from the German side spoke of confusion, frustration, and disbelief. His innovations weren't limited to conventional tactics. He understood the importance of combined arms, coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery in a way that maximized efficiency and minimized risk. Tanks and infantry moved in unison under his direction, covering one another and exploiting every opening. Artillery was used not just to bombard, but to channel enemy movements into predictable patterns. This integration of forces, while standard in theory, was executed with a level of precision rarely seen in the field, and it forced the Germans to adjust constantly, often to no avail. But it wasn't just battlefield maneuvers that set him apart. He had a keen sense of leadership, inspiring his men in ways that statistics and orders could not. Soldiers spoke of the calm authority he exuded, the way he could instill confidence even when the odds were against them. He moved among the ranks, listening, observing, and guiding, ensuring that his presence was both reassuring and commanding. This wasn't the detached leadership of a distant officer. It was a hands-on approach that forged trust and cohesion, and in the chaos of war, such unity became a decisive weapon. The Germans noticed this too. Intelligence reports and intercepted communications revealed a growing sense of anxiety. They weren't just facing Canadian troops. They were facing a commander who seemed to control every movement, anticipate every counterattack, and turn every small advantage into a strategic victory. Officers began to describe him in terms that suggested both respect and fear, a relentless strategist whose presence on the battlefield could shift the balance of power. One of the most striking examples of his ingenuity occurred during a campaign to capture a heavily defended town. The town was surrounded by rivers, hedgerows, and fortified positions that had repelled previous assaults. He devised a plan that combined deception, speed, and precision. Infantry would approach from multiple directions, some visible to draw enemy fire, others hidden to exploit blind spots. Artillery would mask the real attack, and tanks would punch through unexpected lanes. When the assault began, the Germans were caught off guard. They struggled to respond, attempting to shift forces from one flank to another, only to find themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The town fell with fewer casualties than anticipated, and his reputation grew even further. His brilliance wasn't limited to grand battles. Even in small-scale engagements, he demonstrated a tactical acumen that few could match. Skirmishes in villages, forested areas, and narrow lanes became exercises in psychological warfare. He would use noise, light, and movement to create illusions of strength, making enemy commanders overestimate his numbers or misjudge his intentions. Every action, no matter how minor, was part of a larger plan, a web of strategy designed to dominate both space and time on the battlefield. By now, whispers of his prowess had spread far beyond his own army. Allied commanders praised his skill, while German officers dreaded the thought of facing him. Unlike some American generals, who relied on overwhelming force, he relied on ingenuity, adaptability, and the careful orchestration of every resource at his disposal. He turned what might have been a routine advance into a calculated campaign, ensuring that the enemy was always reacting, never initiating. Even more remarkable was his resilience. Battles rarely went perfectly, and setbacks were inevitable. Yet he had an uncanny ability to recover, to turn losses into learning opportunities, and to adapt his strategy on the fly. His decisions were never rushed. They were deliberate, informed by observation and experience. And this combination of patience and aggression, of careful planning and decisive action, made him uniquely feared among his adversaries. As the Allies pushed forward through France and into Belgium, his legend only grew. The German command became increasingly obsessed with his movements, diverting resources, repositioning troops, and issuing warnings to units under the assumption that he might appear anywhere, at any time. The fear wasn't just of his soldiers. It was the fear of facing a mind that seemed several steps ahead, a leader who could turn even desperate circumstances into triumph. And yet, despite the growing fear and legend surrounding him, he remained focused, almost single-minded in his objectives. There was no room for arrogance, no desire for fame, only a relentless drive to achieve the mission and protect the men under his command. Every decision, every maneuver, every risk was calculated with an almost surgical precision. This combination of tactical brilliance, leadership, and moral clarity made him not just effective, but extraordinary. In the next part of this story, we will witness the climactic battles that solidified his place in history. We will see how his strategies, courage, and ingenuity came together in decisive moments that would leave both allies and enemies in awe. And we will discover why, in the annals of World War II, the Germans feared this Canadian general more than any American commander, and why his legacy endures as one of the most formidable leaders of the war. As the Allied forces pressed deeper into Europe, the war's final chapters began to unfold, and the Canadian general's true genius would be put to the ultimate test. The German army, battered but still dangerous, had begun to consolidate its remaining strength, preparing to make a stand in towns, forests, and river crossings that could slow or even halt the advance. For many commanders, these moments were fraught with uncertainty. For him, they were opportunities to exploit his mastery of strategy, psychology, and timing to achieve results that seemed impossible to others. One of the most decisive confrontations came during a critical push toward the Scheldt estuary. This narrow, marshy region was vital for controlling supply lines, yet it was a nightmare to navigate. German defenders had fortified positions, dug trenches, and planted obstacles that seemed to channel any assault into kill zones. It was a trap, the sort that had repelled countless attacks in the past. Many generals would have paused, hesitated, or called for reinforcements. But he saw a path others missed, a way to combine stealth, artillery, and rapid infantry maneuvers to achieve a breakthrough without unnecessary slaughter. He divided his forces with precision, creating diversions while moving his main assault units along unexpected routes. Boats crossed marshes under cover of darkness, engineers dismantled obstacles with astonishing speed, and infantry advanced silently through enemy lines. When the Germans finally realized what was happening, it was too late. Positions that had seemed impregnable were overrun. Soldiers who had expected days of bloody struggle found themselves disoriented, trapped, and eventually surrendered. The victory was swift, decisive, and elegant, a testament to his ability to orchestrate complex operations while keeping his soldiers alive and motivated. Even in moments of chaos, his mind remained unshakable. During one engagement, a sudden counterattack threatened to encircle part of his forces. Communications were jammed, terrain was unfamiliar, and panic threatened to spread. Yet he calmly assessed the situation, repositioned units, and countered the attack with a series of maneuvers that turned the German initiative into their undoing. Troops later recounted how his voice, calm and resolute over the radio, gave them the confidence to hold their ground and fight back. In that moment, it became clear why his reputation inspired not just fear in the enemy, but unshakable loyalty in his own men. What set him apart from other commanders was not simply tactics or bravery, it was his ability to think several moves ahead, to anticipate not just what the enemy would do, but how they would react to his actions. He treated battles like a chessboard, where each unit, each position, each feint could be leveraged to maximum effect. German generals, despite their own experience and intelligence, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered, responding to his designs rather than initiating their own. And in war, being forced to react is often the most dangerous position of all. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his leadership was his humanity. While fear and discipline were crucial tools, he never sacrificed the well-being of his soldiers unnecessarily. He understood that men fight harder when they trust their commander, when they know that decisions are made with both strategy and compassion in mind. His presence on the front lines was not just a statement of courage, it was a statement of solidarity. This created a force that was not only tactically superior, but psychologically resilient, capable of weathering the chaos of combat with confidence and cohesion. As the Allies advanced into the heart of Germany, his legend had become inseparable from the narrative of the war itself. Intelligence reports captured by the Germans often contained words like relentless, unpredictable, and dangerous in reference to him. They feared not only his immediate actions on the battlefield, but the larger consequences of his campaigns, the way his victories disrupted supply lines, demoralized units, and forced entire regions to capitulate. Compared to this, American generals, despite their impressive achievements, were seen as slower, less precise, or more dependent on sheer numbers rather than cunning and audacity. The climax of his story unfolded during the final months of the European campaign, as Allied forces pressed into the industrial heartland of Germany. Cities that had been centers of resistance crumbled under the weight of coordinated offensives, and yet his forces moved with an efficiency that minimized casualties and maximized impact. Every maneuver reflected a deep understanding of strategy, terrain, and human behavior. Every decision carried the weight of experience, intuition, and relentless preparation. By the time the German command realized the full extent of his success, it was already too late. The victories he orchestrated were complete, decisive, and undeniable. When the war finally drew to a close, he emerged not only as a hero among his own people, but as a figure whose reputation had transcended national boundaries. German soldiers, officers, and historians would later recall the fear he inspired, the way he seemed to bend the battlefield to his will, and the uncanny precision with which he achieved objectives. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of disciplined brilliance, of courage under pressure, and of the profound impact one man can have when intellect, experience, and humanity combine in the crucible of war. His story is not just a tale of victory, it is a testament to the power of leadership and vision. In every maneuver, every engagement, every decision, he demonstrated that success is born not merely of numbers, but of foresight, adaptability, and the ability to inspire those around you. He showed that fear, when rightly harnessed, can be a weapon against your enemy, and that respect, loyalty, and trust are just as powerful as tanks, guns, or artillery. Even decades later, military scholars study his campaigns, dissecting his strategies and marveling at his intuition. The Germans may have feared him more than any American commander, but the truth is that his legacy extends far beyond fear. It is a story of courage, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of excellence, a reminder that in the chaos of war, the mind of a single exceptional leader can alter the course of history. As we look back on this remarkable figure, we see a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most feared and respected generals of World War II. His brilliance lay not in raw force, but in vision, precision, and leadership. And while battles have long since faded into history, the lessons he left behind endure. That courage is measured in action, that intelligence is forged in adversity, and that one person, guided by principle and skill, can change the fate of nations. In the end, the Germans feared him because they understood the truth. Facing him was not merely a battle of arms, but a battle of wits, will, and the human spirit. And in that, he remains unmatched, a Canadian general whose legacy reminds us that true greatness is earned not by the size of your army, but by the depth of your mind, the strength of your heart, and the courage to lead when the world itself seems to crumble.